Do you know why the military pays me? I stared my father dead in the eye while the ice in my glass melted. Tell your wife to stop talking about my money. It belongs to me and not her. She needs to learn her place in this dynamic. If she crosses that boundary again, I will stop being polite. Do you understand me? My father broke into a cold sweat right there on his own patio. My name is Nyla. I am 32 years old and a captain in the United States Army Cyber Command. I hold a top-secret security clearance and manage networks that keep this country safe. But to my family in Atlanta, I am just the stubborn disappointment who chose combat boots over high heels and corporate boardrooms. I thought I had escaped their toxic obsession with appearances years ago when I packed my bags and left their house for good. But last 4th of July, they invited me to their lavish barbecue under the guise of family bonding. Surrounded by members of their massive church congregation, my stepmother Vivian stood up and proudly declared that my upcoming $150,000 reenlistment bonus was going to serve as the down payment for my golden child sister's new mansion. I did not scream or throw a fit. I simply smiled, knowing I was about to dismantle their entire fraudulent empire. Before I share exactly how I legally and financially ruined the people who tried to use me as their personal bank, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments section. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives who felt entitled to your hard-earned success. To understand the sheer audacity of Vivian's announcement, you have to understand the Washington family dynamic. On the outside, my father David and his wife Vivian are the pillars of their wealthy Atlanta community. My father runs a trucking logistics company, and Vivian is the head of the women's ministry at one of the largest churches in the state. They drive luxury cars, wear designer clothes to Sunday service, and host extravagant parties at their sprawling suburban estate. But behind the manicured lawns and the perfectly staged family photos, they are drowning in debt and obsessed with maintaining an illusion of wealth. I was never part of that illusion. When I was 18, my father kicked me out because I refused to take out predatory student loans to help fund Vivian's lavish lifestyle. I joined the army to survive, building my own life from absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, my younger half-sister Brianna was given everything. She is 28 now, spends her days posting luxury shopping hauls on social media, and is married to a white man named Connor. Connor claims to be a hotshot venture capitalist from Wall Street, and my parents treat him like a savior. They constantly praise his financial genius while sneering at my government paycheck. 20 minutes before that confrontation with my father, the 4th of July barbecue was in full swing. The backyard of my father's heavily mortgaged mansion looked like a country club networking event. Waitstaff carried trays of expensive brisket and grilled shrimp. At least 50 people from Vivian's church were spread across the patio, dressed in their summer best, sipping expensive cocktails. I sat quietly at a corner table, wearing a simple sundress, completely out of place among the designer labels and loud boasting. I only attended because my father had called me a week prior, sounding genuinely tired, asking if we could put the past behind us. I should have known it was a trap. Vivian was holding court near the massive outdoor kitchen, surrounded by the senior pastors and the most wealthy women in their congregation. She wore a flawless silk outfit and a wide-brimmed hat, laughing loudly and making sure everyone paid attention to her every move. Brianna stood right next to her, rubbing her slightly pregnant belly while showing off a diamond bracelet Connor had supposedly bought her for their anniversary. Connor himself was holding a cigar, lecturing a group of older black men about cryptocurrency investments with a condescending tone that made my blood boil. The sheer arrogance radiating from him was palpable, but my father and his friends just nodded along, desperate to align themselves with Connor's supposed Wall Street success. Then Vivian clapped her hands together to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down as she raised her glass of champagne. Friends and family, she projected her voice so it carried across the entire yard. We have so much to celebrate today. Not only are we blessed with a growing family as Brianna expects her first child, but the Lord has provided us with the perfect opportunity to secure their future. She gestured toward me, and suddenly 50 pairs of eyes shifted in my direction. As many of you know, our Nyla has been working in the military. It is a modest living, but she has finally found a way to truly bless this family. Nyla is about to receive a $150,000 re-enlistment bonus from the Army. She smiled a wide, predatory smile, and she has generously decided to gift that money to Brianna and Connor so they can put the down payment on that beautiful 6-bedroom house in Buckhead they have been looking at. Is not God good? The congregation erupted into applause and cheers. Women were wiping away fake tears, murmuring praises, and clapping their hands. Brianna blew me a kiss from across the yard. My father puffed his chest out, looking incredibly proud of his charitable daughter. I sat perfectly still, my hand gripping my glass of sweet tea. I had never discussed my re-enlistment bonus with anyone in my family. I had never offered them a single dime. Vivian had somehow snooped into my military mail or opened a confidential letter sent to my old home address. She was attempting to publicly corner me. In her mind, she thought the pressure of the entire church congregation would force me to smile, nod, and hand over the money to avoid embarrassing the family. She thought I was still the vulnerable 18-year-old girl they had thrown out on the street. She thought the social pressure of respectability politics would crush my spine. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the absolute delusion of the woman standing before me. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply stood up, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and walked directly toward my father, who was standing near the edge of the patio. The crowd parted slightly, expecting me to give a tearful speech of gratitude for being welcomed back into the family fold. Before I could reach my father, Connor intercepted me. He stepped right into my personal space, blowing a puff of cigar smoke into the air above my head. He had that insufferable, patronizing smirk on his face, the kind of smile reserved for someone he viewed as completely beneath his intellectual level. "Come on, Nyla." Connor said, his voice loud enough for the nearby church elders to hear. "Do not look so stiff. It is a holiday. Your little government paycheck is cute, but let us be real here. You do not know how to manage that kind of capital. Handing the money over to me is the smartest thing you could do. I can roll that cash into my venture fund, generate some real yield, and help you stop being a hired grunt for the government." Brianna sauntered over, linking her arm through Connor's. "Exactly," she chimed in, tossing her hair. "Connor manages millions, Nyla. You are just a soldier. What are you going to do with $150,000 anyway? Buy more combat boots. The family needs this house for the baby. You owe us this much for running away and abandoning the family all those years ago." I looked at Brianna, then at Connor. His white savior complex was so thick it was suffocating. He genuinely believed that, because he wore a tailored suit and threw around Wall Street jargon, I would blindly hand over the money I earned serving my country. He thought my military career was some lowly blue-collar job, completely unaware of the intelligence networks I commanded, the cyber operations I ran daily, or the high-level security clearance I held. He saw a black woman in the military and assumed I was uneducated and desperate for his financial guidance. I did not waste my breath arguing with him or his pregnant wife. I stepped around Connor as if he were a minor physical obstacle in my path and walked straight up to my father. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between Vivian, Connor, and me. That was when I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my message. I delivered the message I had been holding back for years. I made it explicitly clear that my money was mine, and if his wife ever crossed that boundary again, my politeness would instantly vanish. My father broke into a cold sweat right there on his own patio. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He knew exactly what I was capable of, and he knew I was not making an idle threat. Vivian heard me and marched over, her face twisted in indignation. "How dare you speak to your father that way after we opened our home to you, you selfish, ungrateful girl?" I pulled my smartphone from my purse and opened my banking application. I tapped a few buttons on the screen. "Oh, by the way, Vivian," I said calmly without looking up from my screen. "That emergency credit card I let you keep for Dad's medical expenses last year. I just disabled it. I noticed the $5,000 you spent at a luxury boutique last week. You will need to find another way to fund your church outfits." Her jaw dropped. The fake pious smile vanished, replaced by sheer panic. "You cannot do that," she hissed, suddenly aware of the church ladies watching our exchange. "I just did," I replied, dropping my phone back into my purse. "Enjoy your barbecue." I turned on my heel and walked toward the side gate. Connor called after me, yelling that I was making a massive financial mistake and that I would regret turning my back on family. I ignored him. As I walked to my car, my mind was perfectly clear. They thought they could bully me into giving up my re-enlistment bonus to fund their fraudulent lifestyle. They thought I would bow down to the pressure of the church and the community. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I was not just a soldier. I was a cyber intelligence officer. And the moment I started my car, I knew exactly what my next mission was. I was going to digitally dissect Connor's entire financial history, uncover every lie Vivian had ever told, and tear down their house of cards piece by piece. The war had just begun. The next morning started before the sun even had a chance to rise over the Georgia pines. I was already at my desk inside the secure facility at Army Cyber Command. The contrast between my life here and the chaotic circus I had left behind in Atlanta could not have been more extreme. Here inside the windowless walls of the Intelligence Center, everything was ordered, structured, and governed by strict protocols. I held a cup of black coffee in one hand and scrolled through the overnight security reports with the other. My uniform was perfectly pressed, my badges aligned, and my mind was focused on the global networks I was tasked with monitoring. But the peace of my military sanctuary was shattered precisely at 0700 hours. My personal cell phone, which I kept locked in a designated locker outside the secure floor, vibrated with an urgent alert. I had stepped out to grab a fresh coffee and check the screen, expecting a routine update from my calendar. Instead, my blood ran completely cold. The notification was from my primary financial institution, the bank that handled all my military pay and benefits. It was a severe fraud alert warning me of a high-priority credit inquiry that had just been processed. I opened the secure banking application, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. Someone had just initiated a formal application for a Veterans Affairs home loan using my exact social security number, my military service record, and my personal details. I stared at the glowing screen, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was reading. A VA loan is not just another random financial product that anyone can apply for. It is a strictly regulated federal benefit earned through blood, sweat, and personal sacrifice. It allows service members and veterans to purchase a home with zero down payment and highly favorable interest rates. It is the federal government's way of thanking us for putting our lives on the line for this country. And right there, listed as the primary applicants alongside my forged electronic signature, were the names Brianna and Connor. The rage that washed over me was not hot or explosive, it was a cold and calculating fury. Vivian had not just been bragging at the barbecue to save face in front of her congregation. She had actually taken my personal information, likely stolen from old mail or tax documents left at my father's house years ago, and attempted to commit federal wire fraud. She and Connor were trying to use my active-duty military service to secure a multi-million-dollar mortgage for a house they could not afford on their own. They were trying to bind me to a massive 30-year debt, legally tying my hard-earned credit score to their fraudulent lifestyle. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the sheer stupidity of their plan. Did they really think a major financial institution would process a federal military loan without directly contacting the active-duty service member? Did they really believe I would not receive an instant notification the second my credit was pulled by a mortgage lender? They were so blinded by their greed and their desperation to maintain their wealthy facade that they had completely ignored basic security protocols. I immediately tapped the option to freeze my credit across all three major reporting bureaus. I flagged the application as fraudulent, but I did not cancel it entirely just yet. I needed the paper trail to remain active. I needed the digital footprints linking the fraudulent application directly to their home computers. As an intelligence officer, I knew that letting the enemy make a mistake on the official record was always better than stopping them before they left a permanent trace. I leaned against the cold concrete wall of the hallway, letting the reality of their betrayal sink into my bones. My own family was trying to steal my identity to buy a luxury mansion. They saw my years of military service not as a point of pride, but as a free resource to be plundered for their own gain. The disrespect was so profound, it almost took my breath away. I walked back to my locker, secured my phone, and prepared to return to my desk to begin my shift. But before I could even turn the handle, the phone vibrated again. This time it was an incoming call. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I knew exactly what he was going to say, but I needed to hear him say it. I needed him to dig his own grave and confirm his involvement. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear without saying a single word. "Nyla, turn that credit card back on right now." My father's voice boomed through the small speaker, thick with anger and panic. He did not bother asking how I was doing. He did not apologize for the embarrassing scene at the barbecue yesterday. His only concern was the plastic card that funded his wife's vanity. "I have suppliers to pay for the trucking business, and Vivian needs that card for the church charity drive today. You are embarrassing us by cutting it off without warning." I let his words hang in the air for a long moment, listening to his heavy breathing. "I disabled the card because Vivian was using it to buy designer clothes, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "But we have a much bigger problem than a canceled credit card. I just received an alert from my bank. Someone tried to apply for a federal home loan using my social security number and my military service record. And strangely enough, Brianna and Connor are listed as the Kyo applicants on the paperwork." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, meaning he was likely driving to his failing office. "Listen, Nyla." He finally stammered, his aggressive tone faltering into something weak and pleading. "Connor found a great deal on a beautiful house in Buckhead. They need a safe place for the new baby. Your credit is perfect, and with the military benefit, they do not have to put any money down up front. It is just a formality. You just need to sign the final authorization forms they sent to your email. Connor is going to make the monthly payments from his venture fund returns, so it will not cost you a thing. We are family, and you need to do this for your sister." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. He was not calling to apologize for the identity theft. He was calling to demand my active participation in their crime. "You want me to commit mortgage fraud?" I asked, pronouncing every syllable with sharp precision. "You want me to attach my name to a federal loan for a house I will never live in, so your stepdaughter can pretend to be rich on social media? You let your wife steal my identity, and now you are ordering me to sign the papers to make it legal. You have completely lost your mind." My father's temper flared again, refusing to accept any accountability. "You owe us," he shouted through the receiver. "I am your father. I raised you and fed you. You have a duty to help this family when we are in need. You make plenty of money from the government now. It is time you gave back to the people who put a roof over your head." The sheer hypocrisy of his words felt like a physical blow to my chest. "You put a roof over my head?" I repeated, a bitter and hollow laugh escaping my lips. "Do you remember what happened when I turned 18, Dad? Do you remember the night you stood in the kitchen and told me I had to co-sign a massive personal loan because Vivian wanted to remodel the master bathroom with imported tile? When I refused because I wanted to save my credit for college, you packed my bags yourself. You threw me out onto the street in the middle of a freezing November night. You chose your new wife's luxury bathroom over your own teenage daughter. I slept in my freezing car for 2 weeks, shivering every night before I walked into an army recruiting office just so I could have a warm bed and 3 meals a day. I went through grueling basic training. I deployed overseas to combat zones. I spent years climbing the ranks and building a highly respected career from the absolute dirt you left me in. And not once in all those years did you ever come to visit me on base. You never came to a single promotion ceremony to pin a new rank on my chest. You never called to see if I survived my deployments overseas. You abandoned me completely. And now you have the nerve to demand the military benefits I bled for so your favorite daughter can live in a mansion. You are not a father to me. You are a parasite." Before my father could formulate a response or offer another pathetic excuse, I heard the phone being snatched away. The sound of shuffling plastic and a sharp intake of breath told me Vivian had taken over the call. She must have been listening in the background on speakerphone the entire time. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat." Vivian hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. Her Holy Church mother persona was completely gone, replaced by the vicious manipulator she truly was behind closed doors. You are going to sign those loan papers today. Do you hear me? Connor has already promised the sellers we have the financing secured and the earnest money is down. If you ruin this real estate deal for Brianna, I will make your life a living hell. I will stand in front of the entire congregation this Sunday and tell everyone how you selfishly abandoned your family. I will tell them you are mentally unstable from your time in the military and that you are a danger to yourself. I am the head of the women's ministry. I have the ear of every pastor and every influential business owner in this community. I will make sure your name is dragged through the mud until you cannot even show your face in Atlanta ever again. You will be a social outcast. Sign the papers, Nyla, or you will regret testing me. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my honor against her ridiculous and desperate threats. I simply listened to the absolute panic pouring out of her mouth. She was threatening to ruin my social reputation in a city I no longer cared about among people whose superficial opinions meant absolutely nothing to me. It was the hollow threat of a woman who had no real power left and knew her financial walls were closing in. Vivian. I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion and chillingly professional. You just admitted to federal identity theft on a recorded military communication line. Good luck with your church ministry. I pressed the end call button and slid the phone back into my uniform pocket. I walked through the heavy security doors and returned to my workstation. The anger from the morning had completely evaporated, replaced by a singular and chilling focus. They wanted to play dangerous games with my finances. They wanted to threaten my livelihood and my professional reputation to save themselves. It was time to show them what a military cyber intelligence officer actually does for a living. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, flexed my fingers over the keyboard, and stared at the glowing monitors. I opened a secure browser and accessed a series of specialized databases used for open-source intelligence gathering. I typed Connor's full legal name and his supposed Wall Street venture fund into the search parameters. I was going to dig into every public record, every financial filing, every property deed, and every hidden limited liability company attached to my family. I was going to follow the money trail all the way down to the darkest corners of their fraudulent lives. I initiated the background sweep and watched as the data began to cascade across my screens. The truth was hiding in those numbers, and I was going to drag it out into the light. I needed to step off the installation for my lunch break, just to clear my head and grab something that did not taste like government-issued coffee. There was a small, independent cafe about 2 miles outside the main gates of the base. It was a quiet spot, mostly frequented by soldiers in uniform and local contractors taking a breather from the chaotic military environment. I sat in a booth near the back, facing the entrance with my laptop open, reviewing some unclassified training protocols. I was wearing my operational camouflage pattern uniform, my hair pulled back into a strict regulation bun. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of normalcy returning. But that fragile peace evaporated the moment the bells above the cafe door chimed. I did not even have to look up from my screen to know trouble had just walked into the room. The heavy scent of expensive and overpowering designer cologne hit my senses a split second before he slid uninvited into the booth directly across from me. I raised my eyes slowly and found myself staring at Connor. He looked completely absurd sitting in a humble military town cafe, wearing a bespoke navy blue suit, an Italian silk tie, and a watch that cost more than a reliable car. His blonde hair was slicked back with an obscene amount of gel, and he was flashing that signature predatory smile that always made my skin crawl. He leaned back against the vinyl booth, spreading his arms wide and taking up as much space as possible. It was a classic intimidation tactic, a blatant display of unearned confidence and white privilege designed to make me feel small in my own environment. I closed my laptop deliberately, taking my time before acknowledging his presence. "You are a long way from the country club, Connor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The base perimeter is highly monitored, and this cafe is filled with federal agents on their lunch break. You really should not have come here. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh that drew the attention of two sergeants sitting at the next table. Please, Nyla, do not try to use your little military security tactics on me. He waved his hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. I flew down here because we have some serious business to discuss, and your father told me you were being stubborn about the loan paperwork. I figured you just needed someone with actual financial literacy to break down the numbers for you so you can understand the bigger picture. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepled his fingers together. He looked at my uniform with barely concealed disgust. I get it. You have been isolated in this rigid government bubble for years. You get a steady paycheck you eat at the mess hall, and you do not have to think about real-world economics. But out there in the private sector where the real money is made, things are moving fast. We are talking about leveraging liquid assets to maximize return on investment through strategic real estate acquisitions. Do you even know what any of that means? I stared at him, letting his patronizing corporate jargon bounce right off me. He was tossing around basic business vocabulary, like he was giving a keynote address at a major financial summit. I know exactly what it means, Connor, I replied, sipping my black coffee. It means you are trying to use big words to distract me from the fact that you and Vivian committed identity theft this morning. He scoffed and rolled his eyes, running a hand over his slicked back hair. Identity theft is such a dramatic term, Nyla. We are family. Vivian was just expediting the process because the housing market in Buckhead is highly competitive right now. We need to secure the property before interest rates pivot. But honestly, I did not fly all the way down here just to talk about a VA loan. That was Vivian's backup plan. I am here to talk about your TSP. My eyes narrowed slightly. The Thrift Savings Plan is the federal government-sponsored retirement system for military members and federal employees. It was highly protected and deeply personal. How do you even know about my TSP? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. He smirked, clearly proud of his invasive snooping. Your dad mentioned you have been maxing out your contributions since you deployed to combat zones years ago. You have been letting all that capital sit dormant in a slow-moving government fund, earning a pathetic conservative yield. It is financially irresponsible, Nyla. You are leaving money on the table. I need you to liquidate that account today. Cash it out and wire the funds directly to my venture capital firm. If you do that, I can guarantee you a massive return. I will roll your little retirement fund into a high-yield aggressive growth portfolio. I can double your money in 6 months, and we will not even need to use your precious military housing benefit. He was demanding that I cash out over a decade of combat pay and retirement savings to fund his non-existent investment firm. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. He sat there draped in expensive fabric, genuinely believing that because he was a wealthy-looking white man and I was a black woman in a uniform, I would simply bow to his superior intellect and empty my life savings into his hands. You want me to take a massive early withdrawal penalty and hand over my entire federal retirement account to you, I clarified, making sure I was hearing the full extent of his delusion. Yes, he answered without a single ounce of hesitation. Because you are playing small ball, Nyla. You are settling for a mediocre life. I am offering you a seat at the big table. Let the professionals handle the capital. You just focus on whatever it is you do on those computers all day. When I did not immediately pull out my phone and start wiring him my life savings, his arrogant demeanor began to crack. The predatory smile faded, and he leaned closer across the table, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. This was the pivot. I had seen this psychological tactic 100 times during interrogations. When intimidation fails, the subject always pivots to emotional manipulation. Look, Nyla, he said, his voice suddenly dripping with fake sincerity. I did not want to bring this up, but you are leaving me no choice. Your father is in serious trouble. The trucking logistics company is bleeding cash. They have lost 2 major shipping contracts this quarter, and David is drowning in operational debt. He is too proud to tell you the truth, but the company is on the brink of total collapse. I am the only one keeping them afloat right now. I have been moving money around from my own business to cover his payroll so he does not lose everything he has built. I kept my face completely blank, giving him nothing to work with. He took my silence as an invitation to keep pushing the emotional knife deeper. And Brianna? He continued, running a hand over his face to feign exhaustion. Your sister is carrying my child. The pregnancy has been incredibly high risk. She is stressed out and the doctors are worried about her blood pressure. She cries every night because she thinks her older sister hates her. We need to get her into this new house so she can have a stable environment to raise your niece or nephew. The nursery needs to be perfect. The neighborhood needs to be secure. I am trying to hold this entire family together, Nyla. I am trying to save your father's legacy and protect your pregnant sister. But my venture fund has all its capital tied up in aggressive long-term positions right now. I have a temporary liquidity issue. I just need a bridge loan. I need your TSP funds to execute this real estate transaction and keep your father's business from going under. If you do not help us today, this entire family is going to fall apart, and it will be completely on your shoulders. He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for the guilt to wash over me. He had played every card in the emotional blackmail handbook. He painted my father as a tragic, failing patriarch. He used an unborn child as a hostage. He positioned himself as the noble white savior, trying to rescue a sinking black family from their own financial incompetence. And he placed the entire burden of their survival squarely on my shoulders, hoping the weight of generational guilt would crush my boundaries. I let the silence stretch between us for a full minute. I listened to the hum of the coffee machine behind the counter and the low chatter of the soldiers sitting nearby. I watched a bead of sweat form at the edge of Connor's perfectly styled hairline. His confident posture was slowly dissolving into nervous anticipation. Connor. I finally spoke, my voice cutting through the air like a surgical scalpel. For someone who claims to manage a multi-million-dollar venture capital fund, your business logic is incredibly sloppy. In fact, it is completely fundamentally flawed. His arms dropped to his sides and he blinked in confusion. What are you talking about? He stammered. I am talking about the basic mechanics of federal finance and corporate investment, I replied, leaning forward and mirroring his earlier posture, but with genuine lethal authority. First of all, the Thrift Savings Plan is a federally protected tax-deferred retirement account. If I liquidate it before retirement age, I am hit with a 10% early withdrawal penalty plus standard income tax on the entire balance. That means nearly 40% of my capital vanishes into thin air before the money ever hits my checking account. No legitimate financial advisor on the planet would recommend an investor take a 40% guaranteed loss just to fund a residential real estate transaction. It is financial suicide. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand and silenced him instantly. Second, I continued, my tone accelerating. A legitimate venture capital firm pools money from accredited investors to acquire equity in startup companies with high growth potential. Venture capital funds do not under any circumstances solicit retail retirement cash from middle-class family members to execute residential bridge loans. That is a blatant violation of Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. If your fund was legitimate, you would have access to institutional credit facilities, revolving lines of capital from major banks to cover your temporary liquidity issues. The fact that you flew all the way down here to beg a government employee for $150,000 tells me you do not have a venture capital fund. It tells me you do not have institutional backing. It tells me you are totally, utterly broke. The color drained from Connor's face. The arrogant Wall Street persona melted away, revealing the desperate cornered animal hiding underneath the expensive suit. The bead of sweat at his temple rolled down the side of his cheek. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously. You do not know what you are talking about, he whispered, his voice lacking all of its previous bravado. You are just a soldier. You do not understand how high-level finance works. I do not understand finance, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Connor, I am an intelligence officer. I analyze global financial networks to track terrorist funding streams. I monitor international banking protocols for a living. I know exactly what I'm looking at when a man in an expensive suit sits across from me and begs for a bailout using buzzwords he barely understands. I looked him up and down, letting my gaze linger on his trembling hands. You are bleeding cash, Connor. You are drowning. And you thought you could come down here and use your smooth-talking privilege to fleece the one person in this family who actually knows how to read a balance sheet. You thought because I wear a uniform and come from a family that worships the ground you walk on, that I would be an easy mark. I stood up from the booth, towering over him as he shrank back into the vinyl seat. Do not ever approach me on government property again, I said, my voice cold and absolute. Do not ever ask me for money again. And if you or Vivian ever attempt to use my social security number for any financial transaction, I will not call my father to complain. I will call federal law enforcement, and I will have you both indicted for wire fraud. I picked up my laptop and my coffee. Connor sat there completely paralyzed, his chest heaving as the reality of his failure settled over him. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive suit feeling more like a straitjacket. Enjoy your flight back to Atlanta. Connor, I said, looking down at him one last time. I suggest you figure out how to save your own legacy because the Bank of Nyla is permanently closed. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him hyperventilating in the booth. I strode back towards the base gates, the afternoon sun beating down on my uniform. The ambush had failed completely, but it had given me exactly what I needed. Connor was desperate, and desperate people always leave a digital trail of mistakes. I showed my identification to the gate guards and marched straight back to my secure terminal. The warning shots had been fired. Now it was time to drop the bombs. I sat down at my workstation, brought my monitors out of sleep mode, and initiated the deep background investigation. It was time to find out exactly what kind of financial ghost town Connor was actually running. The hum of the servers in the secure facility faded into the background as I locked my eyes onto the dual monitors on my desk. I pulled up the state corporate registry database and typed in the name of Connor's supposed venture capital firm. Apex Horizon Ventures. He had thrown that name around at family dinners for years like it was some heavy-hitting Wall Street institution. I hit the search key and watched the data populate on the screen. The initial results were absolutely pathetic. Apex Horizon was not registered in New York or California or anywhere that housed legitimate financial institutions. It was a domestic limited liability company registered in Delaware just 2 years ago. I pulled the articles of incorporation expecting to see a board of directors, or at least a list of managing partners, to justify the sheer arrogance he carried himself with. The only name listed on the entire document was Connor. He was the sole registered agent, the sole managing member, and the sole employee. I ran a trace on the primary business address listed on his corporate filings. A multi-million-dollar venture capital firm should have a prominent office building, or at least a suite in a respected financial district, to host client meetings and conduct daily operations. The search results returned a street address in a rundown industrial park on the outskirts of Atlanta. I opened a satellite mapping application and zoomed in on the coordinates. It was not an office building at all. It was a virtual mail drop located inside a strip mall shipping center right next to a discount laundromat and a fast food restaurant. He was running his entire financial empire out of a rented mailbox that cost him maybe $30 a month. I leaned back in my chair and shook my head at the absolute absurdity of it all. This was the man who had just sat across from me in a coffee shop and insulted my government paycheck. This was the man who had ridiculed my military career and told me I did not understand high-level finance. I opened a new tab and navigated to his company website. It was a masterpiece of corporate deception. The homepage was plastered with expensive stock photos of businessmen shaking hands in glass elevators and staring intently at rising graphs. The About Us section was filled with empty buzzwords like synergistic capital allocation and dynamic wealth generation strategies. But when I looked for the actual substance, there was absolutely nothing. There were no public disclosures, no listed portfolio companies, no team biographies, and most importantly, no federal filings. If Connor was actively pooling money from investors to fund startup companies as he claimed, he would be required by federal law to file specific disclosures with the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is a mandatory legal requirement for any entity raising capital outside of the public stock market to prevent fraud and ensure transparency. I accessed the federal database and ran a comprehensive search for his name and his company. The system returned 0 results. He had never filed a single piece of paperwork with the federal government to legally raise investment capital. He was entirely unregistered and completely unregulated. He was not a venture capitalist. He was just a guy with a customized website and a closet full of expensive suits playing dress-up while living off the illusion of success. I started digging deeper into his digital footprint, cross-referencing his public tax records with property deeds and vehicle registrations. Everything he owned was financed to the absolute limit. The luxury sports car he drove to church every Sunday to show off his wealth was a short-term lease. The designer clothes he wore were likely purchased on the high-interest credit cards I found linked to his name across multiple banking institutions. He was drowning in consumer debt. His debt-to-income ratio was so catastrophic that no traditional bank would ever approve him for a mortgage. That was exactly why he and Brianna had targeted my military housing benefit earlier that morning. They could not pass a basic credit check on their own, so they needed to hijack my pristine financial record to secure a house they had no business buying. It was a classic parasitic maneuver from people who cared more about appearing wealthy than actually building wealth. But the puzzle was not complete. If he had no legitimate business income and was drowning in personal debt, how was he paying for the lavish lifestyle he flaunted on social media? Brianna was constantly posting pictures of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and designer handbags that cost thousands of dollars. You cannot fund that level of consumption on maxed-out credit cards forever without the bank stepping in and shutting down your accounts. The money had to be coming from somewhere. I shifted my posture, resting my hands on the keyboard as I prepared to dig into the darker side of his financial networks. I opened a specialized tracking interface that allowed me to monitor large volume cash transactions and suspicious banking activity. I needed to see exactly where his incoming cash flow was originating. I ran a wide spectrum query on his primary checking accounts, searching for irregular deposit patterns over the past 24 months. The results took a few minutes to compile, but when they finally rendered across my screen, the blood froze in my veins. The incoming cash flows were not from corporate clients or institutional investors. They were a series of direct wire transfers and personal checks coming from individual bank accounts. I started pulling the names attached to those routing numbers: Reverend Thomas, Deacon Miller, Sister Beatrice, Mother Washington. The names kept scrolling down the screen, forming a list that I recognized instantly. These were not random investors. These were the senior members, the elders, and the wealthiest congregants of my stepmother Vivian's massive church. Connor was running an affinity fraud scheme. He was using Vivian's powerful position as the head of the women's ministry to gain access to the most trusting and wealthy members of the African American megachurch in our hometown. Vivian had practically handed him the keys to the kingdom. She had likely introduced him to the church elders as her brilliant son-in-law from Wall Street, vouching for his character and his financial acumen at every Sunday service and charity dinner. Because he was married to the pastor's favorite ministry leader, and because he wore the right suits and said the right things, the congregation trusted him implicitly. He had convinced hard-working black men and women to hand over their life savings, their retirement funds, and their home equity lines of credit, so he could invest it in his fake venture capital fund. I mapped out the transaction history, and the structure of the scam became undeniably clear. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme executed with sickening precision. There were no real estate acquisitions and no startup investments happening behind the scenes. When a new church member wired him $50,000, he did not invest a single dime of it. He used $20,000 to pay off a previous investor who was demanding their monthly dividend to keep up the illusion that the fund was generating massive returns. He then took the remaining $30,000 and funneled it directly into his personal accounts to pay for Brianna's luxury shopping sprees, his leased sports car, and his expensive lifestyle. He was literally stealing from the elderly members of our community to fund his fake wealthy persona. I tracked the outflow of the stolen funds and felt a rising wave of disgust. The money that Sister Beatrice had likely saved from decades of working as a schoolteacher had been blown on a first-class vacation to Dubai for Brianna. The retirement funds that Deacon Miller had entrusted to Connor had been used to buy the diamond bracelet Brianna was flashing at the barbecue just yesterday. They were parading around the church wearing the stolen futures of the very people who sat next to them in the pews. Vivian had enabled all of it. She had served her entire congregation to a predator on a silver platter, all for the sake of appearances and bragging rights. She had sacrificed her own community to maintain the illusion of a wealthy, successful family. But a Ponzi scheme relies entirely on a constant stream of new victims to pay off the old ones. The moment the new money stops coming in, the entire pyramid collapses under its own weight. I checked the timestamps on the most recent transfers. The incoming deposits had slowed to a trickle over the past 2 months. The church well had finally run dry. No one else was investing because Connor had already bled the wealthiest members dry. But the monthly dividend payouts he owed to the early investors were still coming due. I intercepted a series of frantic emails sent to Connor's business address over the past 48 hours. They were from Reverend Thomas and Deacon Miller. They were demanding their quarterly payouts and threatening to involve their personal lawyers if the funds were not released immediately. Connor was entirely out of time and completely out of money. I ran a final query through the restricted federal law enforcement dockets just to see if anyone else had noticed the financial bleeding. A heavily redacted file popped up in the system. It was a preliminary investigation flag from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC had quietly opened a file on Apex Horizon Ventures 3 weeks ago after a regional bank flagged a series of highly suspicious wire transfers. The federal government was already building a case against him. It was only a matter of time before they handed the file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and armed agents showed up at his door with federal warrants to tear his life apart. Suddenly, the desperate ambush at the coffee shop made perfect sense. The emotional blackmail, the aggressive demands for my military retirement savings, the fake story about my father's business failing to manipulate my emotions. It was all a frantic attempt to save his own skin. He did not care about the family legacy or Brianna's high-risk pregnancy. He needed my $150,000 re-enlistment bonus because it was the exact amount he needed to pay off the angry church elders and buy himself enough time to flee the country or keep the scheme alive a little longer. He wanted to drain my combat pay to cover up his federal crimes before the SEC kicked down his front door and dragged him away in handcuffs. The sheer magnitude of his evil was breathtaking. He had weaponized his white privilege to infiltrate a trusting black church community using my stepmother's social status as a shield, while he robbed them blind without a shred of remorse. He assumed that because he looked a certain way and spoke with a certain corporate cadence, no one in our community would ever question his legitimacy. And when the walls started closing in and his lies began to unravel, he tried to use my military service to bail himself out of a federal prison sentence. He thought I was just a naive soldier who would blindly follow family loyalty over basic financial logic. He had severely underestimated the woman sitting across from him. I sat back in my chair, the sterile light of the monitors reflecting off my face in the quiet intelligence center. Vivian thought she was so smart, parading him around the church like a trophy son-in-law. She thought she had won the ultimate prize by marrying her daughter off to a supposed Wall Street genius. Now the entire house of cards was ready to come crashing down, and it was going to bury all of them in the rubble. I saved all the transaction logs, the corporate filings, the emails, and the federal alert flags into a secure encrypted folder on my terminal. I had the weapon loaded and the safety off. I had every piece of evidence required to completely decimate his life and expose Vivian for the fraud she was. Now, I just needed to wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. The next 72 hours were a blur of encrypted communications and deep-dive financial forensics. I barely left the secure facility, only grabbing a few hours of sleep on a cot in the break room when my eyes burned too much to focus on the screens. I was piecing together the final layers of Connor's Ponzi scheme cross-referencing bank routing numbers with the victim list I had compiled from the church directory. Everything was moving according to my timeline until a high-priority notification shattered the quiet hum of the intelligence center. This alert did not come from my personal bank or the credit bureaus. It came directly from DFAS, the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, the federal agency responsible for managing all military pay and benefits. I opened the secure portal, my stomach nodding as I read the automated message. A change in direct deposit instructions had been initiated for my upcoming $150,000 reenlistment bonus. The funds were scheduled to be rerouted from my primary military credit union to a newly established checking account in the Cayman Islands. Attached to the request was a scanned document, a supposedly notarized general power of attorney, granting Vivian complete financial control over my military assets. I pulled up the document and zoomed in on the signature line. The forgery was actually quite good, much better than the clumsy attempt on the VA loan application. They had somehow managed to replicate my signature and even acquired a fake notary stamp from a local business in Atlanta. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Vivian was not just desperate, she was crossing into the realm of major federal felonies. She and Connor knew the SEC investigation was closing in. They knew they needed that bonus money immediately to keep the Ponzi scheme from collapsing and taking them down with it. When the VA loan failed because I froze my credit, they pivoted to the most dangerous option available. They forged a legal document to steal money directly from the United States government. They were attempting to intercept a payout intended for an active-duty military officer holding a top-secret clearance. I did not feel anger this time. I felt a cold, absolute certainty. The games were over. This was no longer just a toxic family dispute over a canceled credit card or a fake venture capital firm. This was a direct attack on federal infrastructure. I saved the forged power of attorney document, the DFAS, routing instructions, and all the associated metadata to a secure flash drive. I logged off my terminal, adjusted my uniform, and walked straight out of the intelligence center. I did not stop at the coffee shop or the mess hall. I walked directly to the building housing the local detachment of the Army Criminal Investigation Division. The CID office was stark and functional, a stark contrast to the high-tech environment I usually operated in. I requested an immediate meeting with the duty agent, identifying myself by rank and clearance level. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting across a steel desk from Special Agent Hayes, a veteran investigator with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I placed the flash drive on the desk between us. Special Agent Hayes, I began, my voice unwavering. I am reporting a critical security breach and an attempted federal wire fraud involving my military pay and benefits. An individual in Atlanta, Georgia, has submitted a forged general power of attorney to DFAS, attempting to reroute my upcoming reenlistment bonus to an offshore account. He leaned forward, his expression turning deadly serious. He took the flash drive and plugged it into his secure terminal, reviewing the documents I had provided. Forging a military POA is a serious offense, Captain, he said, his eyes scanning the fraudulent signature, especially when it involves a cleared intelligence officer. Do you know who initiated this transfer? Yes, I replied, keeping my posture rigid. The individual is my stepmother, Vivian Washington. She is operating in concert with my brother-in-law, Connor. I then spent the next hour laying out the entire situation. I explained the confrontation at the barbecue, the attempted VA loan fraud, and the mounting financial desperation driving their actions. I did not mention my independent investigation into the Ponzi scheme just yet. I needed CID to focus entirely on the forged federal documents. Agent Hayes took meticulous notes, his demeanor shifting from professional curiosity to intense, focused investigation. We will flag the DFAS transaction immediately, he assured me. We can freeze the transfer before the funds leave the Federal Reserve. But I want to pursue criminal charges against these individuals. If they are willing to forge a POA to steal from an active duty officer, they are a threat to military readiness. I paused, considering my next move very carefully. I could let CID freeze the transaction right now and confront Vivian with the evidence. It would stop the theft and likely result in a quiet arrest. But a quiet arrest was not enough. They had paraded their fake wealth in front of their entire church congregation, using my military service as a prop to secure their fraudulent lifestyle. They needed to face the consequences of their actions in the very arena where they sought their power. Agent Hayes, I said, leaning forward slightly. If you freeze the transaction now, they will know they have been caught. They will destroy evidence and claim it was a misunderstanding or a clerical error. I want you to let the transaction process. Let them believe they have succeeded. Let them walk directly into the federal trap. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he assessed my strategy. You want to execute a controlled delivery. You want us to monitor the funds hitting their offshore account to solidify the wire fraud charges. Exactly, I confirmed. They are hosting a massive community gala this weekend. Vivian is receiving an award, and Connor is scheduled to speak. They believe this money is their salvation. I want the federal government to be the one delivering the reality check. Agent Hayes leaned back in his chair, a slow realization dawning on his face. You want to coordinate the arrest at the gala. It is the only way to ensure all the perpetrators and all the evidence are in one location, I explained. Connor is currently under investigation by the SEC for a massive affinity fraud scheme involving the church members attending that gala. If we coordinate with the federal authorities, we can execute a joint operation. We secure the stolen military funds, we arrest the individuals responsible for the forgery, and we dismantle the entire fraudulent enterprise in front of the victims they have been exploiting. Agent Hayes remained silent for a long moment, evaluating the operational risks and the potential payoff. It was a bold strategy, one that required precise coordination between military investigators and civilian federal agencies. But the evidence I had provided was undeniable, and the opportunity to dismantle a major fraud ring targeting a military officer was too significant to pass up. I will need to loop in the local FBI field office and coordinate with the SEC investigators, he finally said, picking up his secure phone. Captain Washington, you are playing a very dangerous game. If this goes wrong, you could lose that entire bonus. I am well aware of the risks, Agent Hayes, I replied, standing up and adjusting my uniform. But I have spent my entire life watching these people use deception and manipulation to get what they want. It is time they faced an opponent they cannot lie their way out of. I left the CID office with a clear objective. The trap was set and the federal authorities were mobilizing. Vivian and Connor believed they had outsmarted the system. They believed they had successfully stolen my financial future to secure their own. They had no idea that every move they made was being monitored, documented, and prepared for a public execution. The war was escalating, and I was ready to deliver the final, devastating blow. While the federal authorities were mobilizing, my mission was not entirely complete. I had secured the federal warrants for Vivian and Connor, but there was one remaining loose end that I needed to tie up before the gala. My father. I needed to know exactly where David Washington stood in this intricate web of fraud. Was he simply a naive victim of his wife and son-in-law, or was he a willing accomplice? Connor had claimed the trucking company was bleeding cash and losing contracts. I needed to verify the operational health of my father's legacy to determine if he was being bled dry without his knowledge, or if he was handing over the keys to the castle voluntarily. I sat back down at my secure workstation and shifted my focus away from the offshore accounts and the pending federal wire fraud case. I pulled up the commercial registration and financial filings for Washington Logistics. The company had been my father's pride and joy for 2 decades. Growing up, I remember him working late into the night reviewing manifests and managing his fleet of drivers. It was the reason he claimed he could never attend my school events or celebrate my birthdays. The business always came first. I accessed the corporate banking records through a legal financial gateway used for tracking domestic corporate compliance. As the financial statements populated on my screen, the reality of the situation painted a sickening picture. The company was not just struggling, it was actively being pillaged from the inside out. I looked at the quarterly profit and loss statements. The revenue from the shipping contracts was actually relatively stable. The drivers were still making deliveries, and the clients were still paying their invoices on time. The massive financial bleeding Connor had mentioned was not coming from a loss of legitimate business. It was coming from egregious, unchecked executive withdrawals. My father was systematically draining the operational accounts of his own company to fund Vivian's insatiable appetite for luxury and high society status. I traced the outflow of corporate funds over the past 12 months. Thousands of dollars designated for fleet maintenance, truck repairs, and driver payroll were being siphoned into secondary personal accounts. From there, the money was being wired directly to the megachurch as massive charitable donations, keeping Vivian firmly positioned as the top donor and the undisputed queen of the women's ministry. He was pulling operating capital to buy the designer suits Vivian wore on Sundays and the luxury vehicles they leased to maintain their flawless image in the community. But the most damning transfers were the ones going directly to Apex Horizon Ventures. My father was taking money right out of his operational budget to invest in Connor's fake venture capital fund. He knew the business was suffering, but he chose to prioritize the illusion of immense wealth over the actual survival of his life's work. I felt a deep, profound disgust settling in my chest. He was not a victim in any sense of the word. He was actively destroying the livelihood of his loyal truck drivers, the men and women who actually did the hard labor just so he could sit at country club dinners and brag about his successful son-in-law on Wall Street. He had completely abandoned the hard-working ethics that once defined him, trading his integrity for a front-row seat in Vivian's toxic circus. He was willing to let his business collapse and let his employees go hungry as long as he could keep playing the role of the wealthy, powerful patriarch. He was entirely complicit in the financial ruin of his own household. The sheer selfishness of his actions made my stomach turn. I watched the digital trail of money moving from the logistics company to the church to Connor's fraudulent accounts. My father was enabling the entire operation. He was funding the monster that was currently trying to steal my identity and my military benefits. He was not just standing by while his wife committed crimes, he was financing the lifestyle that made those crimes necessary. I highlighted every unauthorized executive withdrawal and compiled them into a master spreadsheet. I needed a complete record of his financial mismanagement because I was about to drop the biggest revelation of his entire life right on his head. I needed to see exactly how much damage he had done before I executed the final phase of my plan. The numbers were staggering. He had pulled nearly $300,000 out of the company in a single year, leaving the operational accounts dangerously close to zero. The business was running on fumes, surviving month to month, only because the remaining drivers were working overtime to fulfill the existing contracts. But as I dug deeper into the corporate liability structure of Washington Logistics, I found something that made the air completely leave my lungs. I moved past the operational accounts and opened the long-term debt obligations. I needed to see exactly how close the company was to total insolvency. I scrolled down to the primary creditor listings, expecting to see a series of high-interest commercial bank loans or predatory lending agencies holding the notes on his trucking fleet. Instead, I saw a single consolidated commercial lien. The entire corporate structure was balanced on a razor-thin wire of debt that my father had carefully hidden from his family, his church, and his friends. He projected the image of a self-made king, but the truth was buried in the restricted ledgers of the commercial banking system. He owned absolutely nothing. The trucks, the warehouse, the contracts, they were all leveraged to the maximum limit. And the most shocking part was the entity holding all of that leverage. I took a deep breath and prepared to open the final encrypted file that contained the ultimate truth about Washington Logistics. 3 years ago, the company had experienced a catastrophic financial collapse. The records showed a massive default on their primary commercial mortgage. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the entire fleet and the headquarters building. My father had been 90 days away from losing everything he had ever built. He had been facing total public humiliation and personal bankruptcy. Then a miracle had occurred. A blind private equity firm structured as a limited liability company out of Delaware had stepped in at the final hour. This anonymous company had purchased the entirety of Washington Logistics' distressed debt from the bank at a premium. They had paid off the commercial lenders, completely restructuring the debt under highly favorable terms. They essentially bought the company outright, but allowed David Washington to remain in his position as the figurehead chief executive officer. They let him keep his title, his corner office, and his dignity. The public never knew the company had failed. Vivian never knew her husband had gone bankrupt. He was allowed to keep playing the successful businessman because an anonymous benefactor had quietly saved his life from total ruin. I stared at the name of the Delaware corporation on the screen, Sentinel Holdings Group. My hands began to tremble, hovering over the keyboard as a wave of absolute devastating realization washed over me. I did not need to run a trace on Sentinel Holdings Group. I did not need to uncover the registered agent or access the corporate formation documents to find out who owned the debt, because I already knew. I owned Sentinel Holdings Group. 3 years ago, I was deployed to a combat zone in the Middle East. I was running forward operating base cybersecurity, working 20-hour shifts in a hostile environment where incoming rocket fire was a daily reality. I was collecting hazardous duty pay, combat zone tax exclusion benefits, and massive operational bonuses. I was sleeping on a cot in a desert, saving every single penny I earned because there was nothing to spend it on. During that deployment, I received a frantic, distressed email from my father. It was the first time he had reached out to me in years. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I was safe in a war zone. He simply confessed that he was about to lose the company and begged to know if I had access to any military loan programs that could save him. Even after he had kicked me out at 18, even after he had chosen Vivian's luxury bathroom over my college education, I could not let him lose everything. He was still my father. So from a dusty terminal in a combat zone, I contacted my military financial advisor. I took my entire life savings, the literal blood money I had earned in a war zone, and I established a blind, limited liability company. I used my combat pay to buy his distressed debt. I saved his company anonymously because I knew his fragile ego could not handle the fact that his discarded military daughter had to rescue him. I gave him a second chance. I gave him grace. I allowed him to keep his pride and his title, hoping that the near miss with bankruptcy would force him to change his ways and appreciate the value of hard work again. Now, sitting in the intelligence center 3 years later, I was looking at exactly what he had done with the grace I had given him. He had taken the second chance funded by my combat deployment, and he had squandered it completely. He had used the financial breathing room I provided to fund Vivian's relentless vanity. He had taken the operational cash flow that I had protected and handed it directly to a white con artist running a Ponzi scheme against his own church community. He had used my silent sacrifice to finance the very people who were now trying to steal my identity and drain my remaining military benefits. The emotional impact of this discovery was not just painful, it was transformative. Any lingering shred of filial piety, any small remaining hope that my father was just a misguided man trapped in a bad marriage completely disintegrated. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the business was technically owned by a private equity firm, and he was still embezzling from it. He had taken the life raft I threw him and used it to build a luxury yacht for his abusive wife. He had betrayed the company, he betrayed his employees, and most importantly, he had betrayed me all over again. I pulled up the master contract for the commercial lien held by Sentinel Holdings Group. The terms I had set 3 years ago were incredibly generous, allowing for missed payments and flexible operational controls. But there was a standard default clause embedded in the contract. If the acting chief executive officer engaged in egregious financial mismanagement or embezzled corporate funds, the holding company had the immediate and unilateral right to call in the entire debt demand, immediate repayment in full, and seize all remaining corporate and personal assets listed as collateral. That included the trucking fleet, the headquarters building, and the suburban mansion they were currently living in. I exported the complete financial ledger showing my father's unauthorized withdrawals and his transfers to Connor's fraudulent venture fund. This was undeniable proof of executive financial mismanagement. I drafted a formal legal notice of default under the letterhead of Sentinel Holdings Group. I did not send it through the mail. I printed the commercial lien, the proof of embezzlement, and the notice of immediate asset seizure and placed them carefully into a sleek black folder. The picture was finally complete. Connor was going to federal prison for running a Ponzi scheme. Vivian was going to be indicted by the Military Criminal Investigation Division for federal wire fraud and forgery. And my father, the man who had thrown me out onto the street and then used my combat pay to fund his fake empire, was going to lose absolutely everything he claimed to own. I had the power to strip him of his title, his company, and his house, all with a single legal document. The upcoming church gala was no longer just an operation to stop a forged power of attorney. It was going to be a complete and total financial execution. They were going to stand on that stage in their designer clothes, basking in the fake adoration of a congregation they had actively robbed, and they were going to be stripped down to nothing in front of the entire city of Atlanta. I closed the secure browser and logged out of the terminal. The emotional weight that had been pressing on my chest for over a decade was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of impending justice. I picked up the black folder containing the destruction of David Washington's legacy and walked out of the intelligence center. The trap was fully armed and I was ready to attend a gala. The drive back to my apartment that evening was quiet, but my mind was operating at maximum processing speed. The annual Pillars of the Community Gala was exactly 4 days away. Growing up in Atlanta, I knew exactly what this event meant to the upper echelon of the African American megachurch society. It was not just a dinner, it was the ultimate stage for respectability politics. It was the one night a year where the wealthiest and most influential members of the congregation gathered in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton to showcase their designer gowns, their tailored tuxedos, and their supposed moral superiority. The church spared no expense for this specific event, booking the largest venue, hiring elite catering services, and transforming the space into a spectacle of opulent wealth, masquerading as divine blessing. Local politicians, city council members, and influential socialites from across the state always bought premium tables to court the powerful voting bloc that the church represented. Vivian had been preparing for this specific night for months. She had practically clawed her way to the top of the planning committee, ensuring that she was not just an attendee, but the absolute center of attention. This year, she was slated to receive the Proverbs 31 Woman of the Year award, a highly coveted title within their religious circle that supposedly recognized exemplary family values, charitable giving, and community leadership. The sheer irony of her receiving an award for moral excellence while actively committing federal wire fraud and enabling a massive Ponzi scheme against the very people applauding her was truly staggering. She had spared no expense for her moment in the spotlight. I knew from scanning her recent credit card transactions that she had dropped over $8,000 on a custom beaded evening gown and a matching custom hat, just to ensure no other woman in the room could outshine her. She had even reserved the platinum VIP table situated right at the front of the stage, directly next to the mayor and the senior pastor. Connor was also playing a massive role in her carefully orchestrated performance. Vivian had leveraged her position on the committee to secure him a spot as a guest speaker for the evening. He was scheduled to give a brief presentation on generational wealth building and the importance of financial stewardship within the Black community. He was going to stand at a podium and look down at a room full of people he was actively robbing, and he was going to lecture them on financial responsibility. He was going to use that stage to solicit even more victims for his hollow venture capital fund, wrapping his predatory greed in the language of faith and prosperity. And my father was going to sit right there at the platinum table playing the role of the proud patriarch, the successful logistics CEO, completely blind to the fact that his entire empire was currently resting in a black folder on my passenger seat. They were constructing a masterpiece of public deception, a flawless image of Black excellence that was entirely funded by deceit, embezzlement, and stolen military benefits. But Vivian was nothing if not a meticulous social strategist. She knew that the incident at the barbecue had created a dangerous ripple in her perfect pond. She knew that I had cut off the emergency credit card, and she was acutely aware that the Buckhead real estate deal for Brianna and Connor was hanging by a thread because I had frozen my credit. She needed a contingency plan. She needed a narrative to protect her reputation in case the residential transaction fell through or in case I decided to show up at the gala and make a scene. She needed to preemptively destroy my credibility so that if I ever tried to speak the truth, the congregation would immediately dismiss me as an unreliable source. I discovered her smear campaign early Tuesday morning when I received a text message from a woman named Sister Renee. Sister Renee had been my Sunday school teacher when I was a teenager and was one of the few people in that church who had always shown me genuine kindness. She still kept in touch, checking on me occasionally during my deployments. Her message was long and filled with cautious concern. She explained that Vivian had hosted a private prayer breakfast for the senior women of the ministry the previous morning. During the breakfast, Vivian had supposedly broken down into theatrical tears, asking the women to lay hands on her and pray for her troubled stepdaughter. According to Sister Renee, Vivian had woven an elaborate and sickening lie. She told the most influential gossips in the church that my time in combat zones had severely damaged my psychological health. She claimed I was suffering from combat-induced mental instability and severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She painted a picture of me as a paranoid, delusional veteran who was aggressively hoarding my government money and having manic episodes. She went on to tell them that Brianna was suffering from a high-risk pregnancy because of the stress I was causing the family. Vivian claimed that she and my father had tried everything to get me psychiatric help, but that I was violently refusing their love and pushing them away out of deeply rooted jealousy toward my sister's perfect marriage and impending motherhood. She explicitly warned the church elders that if I showed up to any community events and said erratic things, they should just pray for my soul and ignore my delusions because I was no longer in my right mind. The sheer evil of her strategy was actually quite brilliant in a sociopathic way. By weaponizing the stigma around veteran mental health, she was completely insulating herself from any accusations I might make. If I told the church Connor was a fraud, they would just shake their heads with pity, believing it was a paranoid delusion. If I said she tried to forge a power of attorney, they would assume it was a fabricated story born from a trauma-induced breakdown. She was setting the stage to invalidate my entire existence, making herself look like a tragically devoted mother bearing the heavy cross of a mentally unstable veteran daughter. She was playing the ultimate victim card to protect her social empire. I thanked Sister Renee for the information and assured her I was perfectly healthy. I did not bother trying to correct the narrative or defend my sanity. There was absolutely no point in arguing with a lie when the truth was about to arrive carrying federal badges and handcuffs. Instead of feeling insulted by her smear campaign, I felt a surge of tactical advantage. Her arrogance had made her incredibly predictable. She was so confident in her social manipulation that she would never suspect a real threat was actually closing in on her. She was completely focused on managing the gossip column while completely ignoring the federal crosshairs resting directly on her forehead. I drove straight from my apartment to the Regional Federal Building in downtown Atlanta. Agent Hayes from the Army Criminal Investigation Division had arranged a joint task force meeting in a secure conference room. When I walked in, the room was already filled with serious-looking individuals in dark suits. Agent Hayes introduced me to Special Agent Carter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Lead Investigator Dawson from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The mood in the room was electric, a tight-coiled energy of professionals who had finally cornered a major target. Dawson from the SEC took the floor first, projecting a complex web of financial transactions onto a screen. "Your cyber intelligence was flawless, Captain Washington," he said, nodding at me with genuine respect. "The data you provided cross-referenced perfectly with our preliminary findings. Connor has been running a classic affinity fraud scheme targeting the specific church congregation linked to your family. He has siphoned over $4 million from at least 30 different elderly victims over the past 2 years. His accounts are completely depleted, and he is currently moving small amounts of cash between shell companies, trying to keep the early investors from reporting him to the authorities. He is an absolute flight risk right now." Agent Carter from the FBI stepped up next. "We have secured the federal indictment for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The warrants are signed and ready for execution. Our initial plan was to hit his residential address tomorrow morning, but Agent Hayes brought us your tactical proposal regarding the upcoming church gala. Agent Hayes looked at me, indicating the floor was mine. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. "Gentlemen," I said, looking at the assembled federal agents, "hitting his residential address will secure the arrest, but it will not address the localized infrastructure that enabled this fraud. Vivian Washington used her position of power within that church to hand-deliver those victims to a predator. She is currently attempting to forge federal military documents to steal my re-enlistment bonus because they are desperate for liquidity. If you arrest him quietly at his home, the church leadership will cover it up. Vivian will spin a narrative that he was falsely accused or that she was a naive victim. She will maintain her power, and the victims will never see the truth until the bankruptcy filings hit the public record." I pulled up the floor plan of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom that I had downloaded earlier. "This gala is the tactical choke point," I explained. Tapping the screen, "Every single person involved is going to be in this room. Connor will be there. Vivian will be there. My father, whose business accounts have been funding this operation, will be there. And most importantly, every single church elder and congregation member who was defrauded will be sitting at those tables. If you execute the warrants during this event, you accomplish 3 things simultaneously. You secure the targets in a controlled environment with limited exit points. You immediately prevent Vivian from destroying any digital evidence on her devices. And you publicly expose the fraud directly to the victims, stripping the enablers of their social power and preventing any possibility of a cover-up." The agents studied the floor plan, murmuring among themselves as they weighed the operational logistics. It was a highly unconventional approach. Federal agencies typically preferred quiet early morning raids to minimize public spectacle and collateral chaos. But the specific nature of affinity fraud relied heavily on the community's trust, and dismantling that false trust in real time had a significant tactical advantage. "It is a high-visibility takedown agent," Carter noted thoughtfully. "The press will likely catch wind of it. It will be a media circus." "Which is exactly what is needed to ensure other potential victims come forward," I countered. "Connor operates in the shadows of respectability. Drag him into the spotlight and the entire network collapses. Furthermore, Vivian is planning to use that stage to publicly announce a fake charitable donation using my stolen military funds. She is going to try to trap me into confirming a transaction she forged. It is the perfect operational trigger." Agent Hayes smiled a grim, satisfied smile. He looked at the FBI and SEC leads. "The Army supports the captain's assessment. The target has attempted to defraud the Department of Defense. We want maximum impact to deter any future attempts against military personnel." After an hour of intense logistical planning, the Joint Task Force agreed to the operation. The FBI would station undercover agents inside the ballroom, posing as catering staff and event security. SEC investigators would be positioned at the perimeter to immediately seize all electronic devices and briefcases belonging to Connor and Vivian. Sid would have agents on site to execute the specific federal warrants regarding the forged military power of attorney. It was going to be a synchronized multi-agency strike designed to completely obliterate their fraudulent empire in a matter of seconds. I left the federal building and sat in my car, taking a deep breath as the magnitude of the impending operation settled over me. I pulled out my phone and opened the digital invitation to the pillars of the community gala that my father had forwarded to my email weeks ago. I had ignored it until now. I tapped the screen and officially registered my RSVP, attending 1 guest. I was not bringing a date. My +1 was going to be the United States Department of Justice. The stage was fully set, and the actors were blindly walking to their marks. All that was left to do was wait for the curtain to rise. The evening of the gala arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of an Atlanta summer. But inside the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, the air was crisp and heavily perfumed. This was the crown jewel event of the megachurch social calendar. The room was a dazzling display of wealth and respectability politics, where the congregation elite gathered to prove their blessings through material excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables draped in heavy ivory linen and towering floral centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids. The attendees moved through the space like actors on a stage, wearing custom-tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. Everywhere I looked, there were forced smiles and strategic handshakes as local politicians mingled with church elders trading favors and securing voting blocks under the guise of holy fellowship. I arrived exactly 45 minutes after the doors opened, deliberately timing my entrance to ensure the majority of the congregation was already seated. I did not wear a silk gown or a designer hat. I wore my army dress blues. The dark blue uniform was meticulously pressed, the gold stripes on my sleeves and the captain bars on my shoulders catching the chandelier light. The rows of ribbons and medals on my chest representing years of combat deployments and cyber intelligence operations sat perfectly aligned against the dark fabric. I looked like exactly what I was, a high-ranking military officer operating in a combat theater. The contrast between my sharp, structured uniform and the flowing, opulent gowns of the church elite was jarring and intentional. The moment I stepped through the double doors, the ambient chatter in the room began to drop. Heads turned and whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. I could feel the weight of their stares heavy with the manufactured pity Vivian had so carefully cultivated. Thanks to her prayer breakfast smear campaign, these people did not look at me and see a decorated intelligence officer. They saw a broken, mentally unstable veteran who was desperately in need of psychiatric intervention. They whispered behind their hands, exchanging knowing glances and tragic sighs, playing their part in the respectable tragedy my stepmother had written for me. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my chin elevated, and my eyes locked dead ahead. I marched through the ballroom with the measured, disciplined stride of a soldier on patrol, letting their whispers bounce right off my armor. I scanned the room, mapping the tactical layout just as Agent Carter and I had discussed. The federal presence was invisible to the untrained eye, but glaringly obvious to me. The two catering staff members standing rigidly near the kitchen exit had the distinct posture of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents. The security guard stationed by the audio-visual control booth was definitely Army Criminal Investigation Division. They were in position watching the room waiting for my signal. My eyes finally landed on the Platinum VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage. It was the most visible seat in the house. My father sat there in a stark white tuxedo, looking every bit the successful patriarch, though his smile seemed tight and strained. Next to him was Brianna, draped in a heavily beaded maternity gown, rubbing her belly for anyone who looked in her direction. Connor sat beside her, looking incredibly smug in a velvet dinner jacket, sipping champagne and working the table like a seasoned politician. And then there was Vivian. She sat at the center of the table looking like royalty in her $8,000 custom gown. The moment she saw me approaching, her eyes widened slightly, a flash of genuine surprise crossing her features before she quickly masked it with a look of tragic maternal concern. She clearly had not expected me to actually show up, especially not wearing my military uniform. She wanted me to hide in shame or arrive looking disheveled to confirm her rumors. Instead, I was standing over her table radiating absolute authority. I did not say a word to any of them. I simply pulled out the empty chair at the edge of their table, sat down, and rested my hands on my lap. My father looked at me, looking terrified. Connor offered a patronizing smirk, leaning back in his chair. Vivian leaned across the table, her voice a harsh whisper, disguised by a frozen smile. "What do you think you are doing wearing that costume here?" she hissed. "This is a formal gala, not a military parade. You are embarrassing the family." I looked her dead in the eye, my expression completely blank. "I am wearing the uniform of a United States Army captain," I replied smoothly. "The exact uniform that earned the re-enlistment bonus you have been bragging about to your friends. I suggest you focus on your award, Vivian. The night is just getting started." She glared at me, her jaw clenching in fury, before she turned her attention back to the stage. The senior pastor, a man whose voice commanded the devotion of thousands, began his opening remarks. praising the Lord for the financial prosperity of the congregation. I watched as Connor nodded along vigorously playing the role of the devout son-in-law. I noticed him occasionally checking his expensive watch, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He was putting on a good show, but the cracks were showing. He knew the angry investors were in this very room. I spotted Reverend Thomas and Deacon Miller sitting 2 tables over, glaring at Connor with barely concealed hostility. They were the early investors in his Ponzi scheme, the ones who had been sending him frantic emails demanding their money. Connor avoided looking in their direction, entirely opting instead to pour himself another glass of champagne. The entire platinum table was a ticking time bomb of debt fraud and desperation wrapped in a beautiful, expensive package. The undercover agents moved silently around the perimeter of the room, refilling water glasses and adjusting floral arrangements while keeping their earpieces discreetly hidden. The coordination was flawless. Every exit was covered. Every target was isolated. The trap was fully enclosed and the main event was about to begin. After a lengthy dinner service filled with hollow small talk and uncomfortable silence at our table, the room lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the main stage and the senior pastor returned to the podium. His booming voice filled the ballroom as he announced the highly anticipated Proverbs 31 Woman of the Year award. He spoke endlessly about grace, humility, and unwavering dedication to the church family. When he finally called Vivian Washington to the stage, the congregation erupted into thunderous applause. The string quartet in the corner played a swelling, triumphant melody as my stepmother stood up. She smoothed her expensive custom gown, patted my father on the shoulder, and began her slow, regal walk to the stage. She paused multiple times to hug church elders and wipe away fake tears of overwhelming gratitude. It was a masterclass in religious theater. Vivian reached the podium and accepted the heavy glass award, holding it up like a trophy. She adjusted the microphone, taking a deep, shaky breath as she looked out over the sea of admiring faces. "Thank you." She began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. "To be recognized by my spiritual family is the greatest honor of my life. But I cannot accept this award without acknowledging that my strength comes from the profound trials the Lord has placed in my path." She paused, dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue. The room was completely silent, hanging on her every word. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was preparing the narrative battlefield. "We all struggle," she continued, her voice projecting a heartbreaking vulnerability. "Behind the beautiful clothes and the successful businesses, my family has been carrying a very heavy cross. Many of you know my stepdaughter Nyla." She gestured dramatically toward our table, and suddenly a spotlight swung over, illuminating me in my military uniform. I did not flinch, keeping my posture rigid and my face impassive. "Nyla has served our country bravely," Vivian said, her voice breaking slightly. "But war leaves deep, invisible scars. When she returned to us, she brought the darkness of combat back with her. We have spent years watching her suffer from severe mental instability, pushing away our love, consumed by a paranoia and a selfishness that breaks a mother's heart. I have spent countless nights on my knees praying for her fractured mind, begging God to heal her profound brokenness and bring her back to the family fold." A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the ballroom. Older women shook their heads in pity, whispering prayers for the poor, traumatized soldier. My father stared down at the table, unable to look at me, while allowing his wife to completely assassinate my character in front of the entire city. Brianna wiped a fake tear from her cheek and Connor just sat there looking incredibly pleased with the setup. Vivian was executing her plan flawlessly, building an impenetrable wall of victimhood around herself, while completely invalidating anything I might say or do. "But God is a God of miracles," Vivian continued, her voice rising with sudden triumphant energy. "He answers prayers in His own time. Tonight, I stand before you, not just as a leader in this church, but as a mother who has witnessed a breakthrough. After years of darkness, Nyla has finally seen the light. The Lord has touched her heart and softened her spirit. She has realized the importance of family and community. She gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone for maximum impact. As a testament to her healing and her renewed faith, Nyla has made a monumental decision. Tomorrow she will receive a very large military bonus for her continued service. But rather than hoarding that money in her sickness, she has chosen to give it all back to the community that prayed for her. She smiled, looking directly at me with eyes full of malicious victory. Nyla is officially donating her entire $150,000 military bonus to Apex Horizon Ventures, the incredible investment fund run by my brilliant son-in-law Connor. This money will be used to generate wealth for the church community and to provide a beautiful new home for her pregnant sister Brianna. Praise the Lord for her restored mind and her generous spirit. The ballroom exploded into a standing ovation. People were cheering, shouting hallelujah and clapping their hands. The spotlight grew brighter on me, pinning me in place. This was her ultimate public trap. She had used her award speech to publicly bind me to the fraudulent transaction. She knew that in this specific cultural setting, standing up and denying a charitable blessing in front of 1,000 influential church members would be social suicide. She expected me to shrink under the crushing weight of respectability politics. She expected me to sit there humiliated and defeated and quietly hand over my combat pay to save face in a room full of powerful people. She thought the overwhelming pressure of the congregation would force me into silent compliance. I sat perfectly still, letting the thunderous applause wash over me. I looked at Vivian standing on the stage, clutching her award with a sickening look of absolute triumph on her face. I looked at Connor, who was clapping loudly, a greedy, desperate hunger in his eyes, knowing that this fake donation was his only ticket out of a federal indictment. They really thought they had won. They thought they had cornered the mentally unstable black sheep of the family and successfully looted my federal benefits in front of the entire city. The applause began to die down, and Vivian motioned for me to stand up and wave to the crowd. It was the final command in her orchestrated performance. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up, adjusting the medals on my chest. But I did not wave to the crowd. I turned my back to my father and his fraudulent son-in-law, and I began to walk steadily toward the stage. The trap had officially snapped shut, but Vivian had no idea she was the one locked inside it. The walk from the platinum table to the main stage felt like moving through deep water. Every single eye in the grand ballroom was fixed on me, tracking my military dress blues as I navigated the narrow aisles between the linen-draped tables. The applause that had erupted at Vivian's announcement had completely died down, replaced by a suffocating silence of anticipation. The congregation expected a tearful breakdown. They expected the broken, mentally unstable veteran to step up to the microphone and surrender her hard-earned money in a desperate plea for family acceptance. I could hear the faint rustle of expensive fabrics and the clinking of ice in crystal glasses as the city's elite leaned forward, eager to consume the tragic spectacle my stepmother had promised them. I kept my eyes locked on the podium, my face a mask of absolute military discipline. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs, clutching her heavy glass award. Her face stretched into a grotesque mask of maternal martyrdom. As I placed my foot on the first carpeted step, she extended her free arm, preparing to pull me into a highly photographed embrace. She wanted the picture of the prodigal daughter returning to the fold. I did not break my stride. I stepped neatly around her outstretched arm, denying her the physical contact she so desperately craved for the cameras. The fake smile on her face faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes flashing with pure venom before she quickly rearranged her features into a look of patient suffering. "Nyla, sweetheart," Vivian whispered, leaning close to the microphone so the entire room could hear her manufactured empathy. "Just tell them how the Lord has healed your mind and how you are blessing your sister tonight. It is okay to be nervous. We are all family here." I stepped up to the podium and wrapped my hands around the polished wood edges. I looked out over the sea of faces, the local politicians, the wealthy business owners, the church elders who had unknowingly funded my family's fraudulent empire. I could see my father sitting frozen at the front table, his face pale under the ballroom lights. Brianna was glaring at me, her arms crossed defensively over her pregnant belly. And Connor was leaning forward, his eyes hungry, completely oblivious to the federal agents quietly shifting their positions near the exit doors. I did not yield to the pressure of the room. I did not let my voice tremble. I reached into the breast pocket of my dress uniform and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. The audiovisual control booth at the back of the ballroom was currently secured by an undercover criminal investigation division agent who was watching me through the glass partition. I caught his eye and gave him a microscopic nod. I plugged a small digital adapter into the base of my phone and connected it to the podium's presentation interface. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which had previously displayed the church's golden logo, flickered for a brief second. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the audience as the cheerful religious branding vanished completely. In its place, the screens illuminated the dark ballroom with the stark, glaring reality of federal law enforcement documents. The header of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission was projected in massive letters across the walls. Under the federal seal was a heavily detailed financial flowchart tracing millions of dollars in illegal wire transfers. I tapped the screen of my phone, pulling up the specific bank routing numbers and the fake limited liability company registrations I had uncovered during my intelligence sweep. The documents displayed Connor's face alongside his fraudulent business credentials, cross-referenced with the actual offshore accounts where he had been hiding the stolen money. I adjusted the microphone, bringing it closer to my mouth. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, breathless vacuum of shock as 1,000 people stared at the undeniable proof of their financial ruin. My voice rang out through the speakers, steady and cold, cutting through the opulent atmosphere like a blade. "I am not here to offer a charitable donation," I said, my words echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "And I am certainly not here to fund a residential real estate transaction for a man who belongs in federal prison." Vivian gasped loudly, grabbing my arm. "What are you doing?" she hissed frantically, trying to pull me away from the microphone. "Turn that off right now, you are having an episode. Somebody cut the projector, she is sick." She turned to the crowd, attempting to salvage her narrative. "Please forgive her mind, she does not know what she is saying, the trauma has completely blinded her to reality." I effortlessly shrugged off her grip, stepping firmly back up to the microphone. "My mind is perfectly clear, Vivian." I stated, the absolute authority in my tone, silencing her frantic protests. I then directed my attention entirely to the sea of horrified faces in the congregation. I looked directly at Reverend Thomas and Deacon Miller, who were staring at the screens with their mouths open, recognizing their own banking details listed in the compromised transfer logs. "I need every person in this room who invested their retirement funds, their savings, and their home equity into Apex Horizon Ventures to look very closely at the screens behind me," I announced. My brother-in-law Connor is not a Wall Street genius. He is not a financial visionary. He is a con artist who has been running a massive affinity fraud scheme against this very church. He has been systematically stealing your retirement funds to pay for his luxury vehicles, his designer suits, and his excessive lifestyle. A wave of raw panic erupted in the ballroom. The polite, respectable silence shattered completely, replaced by the sounds of chairs scraping violently against the floor and people shouting in disbelief. I swiped my screen, transitioning the presentation to the next slide. It showed the direct transactions, the exact amounts of money taken from the church elders, and the corresponding receipts for Brianna's diamond jewelry and Vivian's first-class vacations. "There are no startup investments," I continued, my voice projecting over the rising chaos. "There are no real estate acquisitions. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, and his accounts are completely empty. The reason my stepmother stood on this stage and tried to publicly humiliate me into handing over my military re-enlistment bonus is because they are desperate. They needed my combat pay to cover the dividend checks they owe you this week before the federal government kicked down their door." They used this church and this community as a personal piggy bank, and they used my uniform as a prop to buy themselves time. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Deacon Miller, a man who had built his construction business from the ground up, stood up from his table, his face flushed with pure rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the platinum table. "You stole my pension!" He roared, his voice cracking with devastation. "My grandchildren's college fund, you thief!" Other investors began to stand up, shouting and demanding answers, pushing past the waiters to get closer to the front. The illusion of the wholly wealthy family was completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. I watched Connor from the stage. The arrogant smirk had been entirely wiped from his face. He was staring at the massive projections of his federal indictment, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked around the room, seeing the angry congregation closing in on him. He looked at my father, who was sitting frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. And then Connor made the exact mistake the federal agents had been waiting for. Panic overtook his minimal common sense. He pushed his chair back so violently it crashed into the table behind him. He abandoned his pregnant wife, abandoned his mother-in-law, and made a desperate sprint toward the kitchen exit doors. He did not make it more than 10 feet. The two catering staff members standing by the exit instantly dropped their trays of champagne glasses. The glass shattered loudly against the polished floor, a sharp, ringing sound that pierced the chaotic shouting of the ballroom. The agents moved with terrifying speed, shedding their waiter disguises and drawing their federal badges. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," one of the agents shouted, tackling Connor with enough force to send them both crashing into a floral display. "Do not move. Put your hands behind your back." At the exact same moment, the heavy wooden doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open. A dozen uniformed FBI and SEC agents flooded into the room, creating a perimeter and locking down the venue. "Nobody leaves the building," the lead agent commanded over a megaphone. The entire congregation screamed, falling back away from the tables as the reality of the federal raid set in. Women in expensive gowns clutched their pearls, backing away in sheer terror. The high society gala had officially become an active crime scene. Brianna stood up from the platinum table, clutching her pregnant belly, and began screaming hysterically. "Connor, what is happening? Let him go. You are hurting him," she wailed, her shrill voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. She tried to run toward him, but a federal agent stepped in her path, holding up a hand to keep her back. "Mom, stay where you are. This man is under federal arrest for securities fraud and money laundering," the agent stated firmly. Connor was writhing on the ground, his expensive velvet dinner jacket ruined as the agents wrenched his arms behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing clearly in the space near the front tables. "This is a mistake," he yelled, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I have the money. I was going to pay them back. You do not understand finance." The agents hauled him to his feet, ignoring his frantic excuses. They patted him down, extracting his wallet and his phone, dropping them into an evidence bag right in front of the horrified elite of Atlanta. I stood at the podium watching the absolute destruction of the white savior who had tried to belittle my military career just days prior. He was crying now, actual tears of fear streaming down his face as they marched him through the ballroom past the people he had robbed. The church elders who had previously worshipped the ground he walked on now watched him with absolute disgust. The respectability politics that had shielded him were gone. He was just a common thief, stripped of his power and his privilege, caught in the blinding light of the truth. The operation was executing flawlessly, but the takedown was only half complete. Connor was in custody, but the architects of my misery were still standing in the room. I looked over at Vivian, who was clutching the podium. Her knuckles white, her face a mask of absolute terror. The walls were closing in on her, and the federal trap had only just begun to snap shut. Vivian stood frozen at the edge of the stage, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she clutched the heavy glass award to her chest. The ballroom was a chaotic symphony of shouting investors and federal agents hauling Connor out through the main doors. But Vivian was not looking at her disgraced son-in-law. Her eyes were locked entirely on me, wide and frantic like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had no exit. The facade of the pious, long-suffering church mother completely shattered. The heavy glass award slipped from her trembling fingers and crashed against the polished wooden floor of the stage, splintering into a dozen jagged pieces. The sharp sound broke whatever mental restraint she had left. She lost her mind completely right there under the bright stage lights. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the ballroom in a shrill, hysterical shriek. "You are a demon!" she screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure venom. "You are a wicked, possessed thing sent by the devil to destroy this holy family. You could not stand to see us blessed, so you came here to tear down the righteous, to humiliate the servants of the Lord." She spun wildly to face the congregation, attempting to weaponize their faith one last time to save her crumbling social empire. "Do not listen to her," she begged the crowd, her voice cracking with desperate manipulation. "She is sick in the head. She is a jealous, bitter woman trying to steal our joy and ruin our good name." Down at the platinum table, my father finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The sight of his wife screaming on a stage while federal agents secured the perimeter had completely overwhelmed his senses. But his deep-seated obsession with his public reputation suddenly overrode his shock. He scrambled out of his chair, knocking over a crystal water pitcher, and marched heavily toward the stage steps. His face was flushed a deep, angry purple, completely consumed by the desperate need to protect his image and salvage the respectable persona he had worshipped for decades. "Nyla, that is enough," he bellowed, stepping onto the stage and pointing a commanding finger at my face. "Step down from that podium right now and stop this madness. You have ruined this entire evening and embarrassed this family in front of the mayor and the church elders. You will fix this narrative immediately before you destroy everything I have built." I did not flinch, and I did not step back. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my military uniform and pulled out the folded document I had retrieved from the Defense Finance and Accounting Service portal. I unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately, ensuring the movement drew the eyes of every person in the front rows. I held it up in the harsh light of the projector, displaying the forged general power of attorney that bore a fake notary stamp and my falsified signature. "I am not destroying anything, Dad," I replied, my voice echoing coldly through the ballroom speakers. "I am simply protecting federal assets from a criminal." I turned my gaze back to Vivian, who was currently hyperventilating, her eyes darting between the document in my hand and the exit doors. "You did not just aid a Ponzi scheme, Vivian," I announced, ensuring the entire congregation heard every single syllable. "When the fake venture capital well ran dry and you realized your son-in-law was about to be indicted, you got desperate. You forged a federal document. You submitted this fake power of attorney to the United States military, attempting to reroute my entire combat re-enlistment bonus into an offshore checking account. You tried to steal from an active-duty intelligence officer to cover your fraudulent tracks." Vivian physically recoiled as the undeniable truth of her felony was broadcast to her peers. She looked out at the faces of her friends, her fellow committee members, the women she had gossiped with and manipulated for years. They were all staring back at her with a mixture of revulsion and disbelief. The power she had spent decades cultivating evaporated in an instant, leaving her entirely isolated on that stage. Her entire identity had been constructed around being the most righteous, the most charitable, the most blessed woman in the congregation. Now she was nothing more than a common criminal caught red-handed, trying to steal from a military officer. "You are lying," she gasped, backing away toward the edge of the stage. "I never touched your money. It is a setup." From the shadows near the audiovisual booth, 3 men in dark suits stepped forward. The man in the center was Special Agent Hayes from the Army Criminal Investigation Division. His military bearing was unmistakable as he walked up the stage stairs, his badge prominently displayed on his belt. He did not shout or make a dramatic scene. His authority was quiet and absolute. Vivian Washington. He stated, his voice calm, but carrying the heavy weight of federal law. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery against a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. Vivian let out a piercing wail, attempting to stumble backward, but the two other agents quickly flanked her, closing off any path of escape. She thrashed against them, her expensive custom gown wrinkling and twisting as the agents firmly gripped her arms and pulled them behind her back. "Get your hands off me!" she screamed, her voice shrill with genuine terror as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "David, do something, tell them who I am. Tell them they are making a mistake." She looked wildly at my father, begging him to use his perceived power to save her from the consequences of her own greed. But there was nothing my father could do. He was powerless against the federal government. The agents escorted Vivian down the stage stairs, matching her frantic steps with smooth professional strides. The woman who had spent months plotting to steal my identity and humiliate me was now being marched out of her own gala in handcuffs, her head bowed in absolute disgrace as the congregation watched in stunned silence. With his wife being dragged out the main doors and his son-in-law already secured in an FBI transport van, my father was left standing alone on the stage with me. The illusion of his perfect wealthy family had been completely incinerated, leaving only ashes. But instead of showing remorse or humility, his bruised ego flared into a blinding, arrogant rage. He turned to me, his chest heaving with indignation, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "You have no respect," he shouted, his voice shaking with absolute fury. "You come in here wearing that uniform, acting like you own the world, and you tear my life apart. I am the head of this family. I am a self-made man. I built a logistics empire from the dirt up with my bare hands, while you were off playing soldier in the desert. I demand respect in my own community. You owe me for the life I gave you, and you repay me by bringing the federal government to my front door." I stared at the man who had thrown me out onto the street when I was 18 years old. I looked at the man who had prioritized his wife's vanity over his daughter's survival. He was still clinging to the delusion of his own greatness, still believing that he was a titan of industry who commanded respect through sheer entrepreneurial willpower. It was time to drop the final payload. It was time to execute the absolute financial destruction of David Washington. I stepped away from the podium and walked over to the small table where I had set down my cover. Next to it rested the sleek black folder containing the master ledgers and the commercial lien documents. I picked up the folder and walked back to where my father stood fuming. I did not hand the folder to him. I opened it myself and pulled out the thick stack of legal papers stamped with the seal of the state of Delaware. "You are not a self-made man." "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that only he and the front row of the congregation could hear. "You are a figurehead, a hollow king sitting on a throne of debt." I held up the commercial mortgage documents, ensuring he could see the letterhead clearly. 3 years ago, Washington Logistics went completely bankrupt. You defaulted on your primary commercial loans. The bank was 90 days away from foreclosing on your entire fleet and locking the doors to your headquarters. You were completely ruined. The angry red flush vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a sickening chalky white pallor. His eyes widened in terror as he recognized the highly confidential financial documents he had spent years hiding from his church and his family. "How do you have those?" he stammered, his voice suddenly weak and trembling. "Those are confidential holding company files." "I have them because I own the holding company," I stated clearly, letting the devastating truth sink deep into his bones. "Sentinel Holdings Group is my blind limited liability company. When you emailed me begging for help while I was deployed to a combat zone, I took my entire life savings, my hazard pay, and my operational bonuses, and I bought your distressed debt from the bank. I saved your company anonymously because I knew your fragile ego could not handle being rescued by the daughter you threw away. I am your sole creditor, Dad. I own the trucks, I own the warehouse, and I hold the lien on the mansion you live in." My father physically staggered backwards, as if he had been struck by a tangible force. He grabbed the edge of the podium to keep his balance, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The reality of his existence was shattering in real time. The wealthy patriarch persona he had projected to the entire city was completely funded by the silent sacrifice of the daughter he had treated like garbage. "And what did you do with the grace I gave you?" I continued, stepping closer to him, my voice unwavering and sharp. "You embezzled from your own operational budget." "I have the entire ledger, Dad. I tracked every unauthorized executive withdrawal. You siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the company to buy Vivian's designer dresses, to lease your luxury cars, and to dump cash directly into Connor's fraudulent Ponzi scheme. You stole from your hard-working truck drivers to fund a criminal enterprise just to look wealthy at a church gala." "Nyla, please," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. His knees were shaking, and tears of absolute panic were welling in his eyes. "I did not know the fund was a scam. Vivian told me it was a guaranteed return. We were going to pay the company back, I swear to God." "I do not care about your excuses, Dad," I interrupted, cutting off his pathetic attempts at justification. "You breached the terms of the commercial lien the moment you embezzled corporate funds to finance personal luxury." I pulled the formal notice of default from the back of the folder and slapped it directly against his chest. He caught it reflexively, his hands shaking violently as he looked down at the eviction and asset seizure notice. "As of tonight, I am officially calling in the loan," I announced, delivering the final lethal blow to his crumbling empire. "Sentinel Holdings Group is seizing all corporate assets and executing the collateral clause on your residential property. You and your wife have exactly 72 hours to pack your bags and vacate the premises before I send the sheriff to physically remove you from my property. You own absolutely nothing." My father looked at the legal document in his hands and then looked up at me, his eyes wide with a profound, devastating emptiness. The realization that he had literally handed his entire life over to the daughter he despised finally broke his spirit completely. He looked down at his expensive white tuxedo jacket, now crumpled and stained from his collapse onto the hard wooden stage. He looked out at the massive empty ballroom, where only a few moments ago he had been treated like absolute royalty. The transition from a king to a beggar happened so violently fast that his brain could not process the destruction. All his boasts, all his pride, all his arrogance vanished into the cold, harsh reality of total bankruptcy. He had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to worship at the altar of respectability, and now that very altar was collapsing on top of him, crushing him underneath the weight of his own profound failures. He let out a choked, gasping sob, and his legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the stage floor, clutching the default notice, dropping to his knees right in front of the empty podium. He wept openly, a broken, ruined man, mourning the total loss of his fake legacy and his stolen wealth. I looked down at him, feeling no pity and no remorse. I had carried the weight of his rejection for over a decade. I had survived his cruelty and built an honorable life from the scraps he left me. I turned my back on his sobbing form, leaving him on his knees in front of the congregation that now knew all his darkest secrets. I walked down the stage stairs, striding past the silent, horrified guests, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom, stepping out into the cool, quiet night, leaving the ashes of their fraudulent empire far behind me. Exactly 1 week later, the Georgia skies opened up and delivered a torrential downpour over the military installation. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my car, waiting in the outbound lane near the main security gates. The heavy rain was drumming a relentless rhythm against the windshield, blurring the world outside into a wash of gray. Through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, I saw a figure standing outside the visitor center, getting completely drenched by the storm. It was my father. He was unrecognizable from the arrogant patriarch who had tried to command me on the gala stage just 7 days prior. The pristine white tuxedo and the aura of unearned wealth were entirely gone. He was wearing a cheap nylon jacket that offered no protection against the elements. his shoulders hunched, his expensive shoes ruined in the muddy puddles near the guard shack. He was desperately trying to argue with two armed military police officers who were firmly blocking his path and denying him entry to the federal installation. The MPS had their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, maintaining a strict perimeter against a man who looked like a desperate vagrant. I put my car into drive and slowly pulled up to the security checkpoint, stopping right next to where he was pleading with the guards. The MP recognized my vehicle and gave me a sharp salute before stepping back to give me a clear line of sight. I pressed the button and my passenger window glided down, letting the cold, damp air rush into the quiet cabin of my car. My father turned his head and saw me sitting there in my uniform, warm and secure. He rushed to the side of my car, gripping the wet edge of the window frame with trembling fingers. "Nyla, please, you have to talk to me," he begged, his voice cracking, completely stripped of all its former pride and arrogance. "They locked the gates to the house yesterday. The trucks are gone. The bank accounts are frozen. I have nothing left. Nyla, absolutely nothing." Water was dripping from his graying hair, running down his face, masking the tears that were streaming from his eyes. "It was not my fault," he pleaded desperately, trying to shift the blame to save himself. "Vivian manipulated me. Connor lied to all of us about the investments. I was just trying to keep the family together. They tricked me, Nyla, you have to believe me. I would never intentionally hurt you. Give me a second chance, please. Just give me time to fix this." I looked at the man who had thrown me out into the cold when I was 18. I looked at the man who had stolen the combat pay I used to save his life. There was no anger left in my heart and absolutely no forgiveness either. There was only an overwhelming, profound emptiness where a father should have been. I stared into his desperate eyes and delivered the final absolute boundary. "Actions have consequences," I said, my voice steady and cold, cutting through the sound of the pouring rain. "You chose your image over your daughter. We are done." I pressed the button, and the window rolled up smoothly, severing his grip on the glass and cutting off his frantic apologies. I put the car in gear and drove away, splashing a puddle of cold water against his legs, leaving him standing alone in the storm to face the ruins of the life he had chosen. The destruction of their fraudulent empire played out across the local news and federal dockets with ruthless efficiency over the next few months. Connor was denied bail, entirely deemed an extreme flight risk by the federal judge. He traded his bespoke Italian suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, sitting in a federal holding facility while his public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal. The sheer volume of financial evidence I had handed to the Securities and Exchange Commission ensured he had no way out. He was facing 15 years in federal prison for orchestrating the affinity fraud scheme and money laundering. Vivian suffered a fate arguably worse than prison for a woman obsessed with social status. The Military Criminal Investigation Division indicted her on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and forgery. The moment the charges went public, the megachurch senior pastor formally excommunicated her from the congregation to protect the church's reputation. The women she had gossiped with and manipulated for decades turned their backs on her, completely treating her like a pariah. She was entirely exiled from the high society circles she had worshipped, stripped of her titles and her false piety, facing her upcoming criminal trial completely alone. Brianna was violently pulled from her delusion of luxury, with Connor's stolen funds frozen by the federal government and my father's embezzled cash completely seized by my holding company. She had no safety net left. The custom Buckhead mansion she had bragged about was foreclosed upon before she could even pack her designer clothes. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Heavily pregnant and completely broke, selling her expensive handbags online just to afford basic groceries and medical care. She was finally forced to live the miserable, struggling life she had always mocked me for having. I was sitting at my desk in the secure intelligence facility, the ambient hum of the server racks providing a familiar, comforting background noise. The heavy steel door to the floor opened, and my commanding officer walked in carrying a dark blue folder. He walked directly to my workstation and placed the folder on my desk with a proud smile. Congratulations, Nyla, he said, tapping the official seal on the cover. The promotion board results just posted. He opened the folder to reveal a pair of silver oak leaf insignias and a stack of official orders. I was officially being promoted to the rank of major, and my new orders assigned me to a highly prestigious cyber warfare division at the Pentagon. I stood up and looked around the room at the men and women in uniform sitting at their terminals. They were professionals who operated with integrity, loyalty, and unwavering support. They had never judged my worth by my bank account or the designer clothes I wore. They were the people who had stood by me during combat deployments and supported me through the hardest days of my life. I looked at my authentic chosen family, and a genuine smile finally broke across my face. The family I was born into had tried to break me, exploit me, and use my success as a stepping stone for their own greed. They thought I was just a scapegoat they could manipulate in the shadows of their respectability. But they were wrong. The scapegoat did not just survive the slaughter. She conquered the entire mountain. The most powerful takeaway from Nyla's journey is that biological ties do not excuse financial abuse or emotional manipulation. When toxic relatives weaponize the concept of family loyalty to exploit your hard-earned success, establishing ironclad boundaries is not a betrayal. It is an absolute necessity for your survival. You do not owe your peace, resources, or future to people who only value you for what they can extract. True empowerment comes from recognizing your own worth, cutting off parasitic relationships, and having the courage to walk away to build an authentic, chosen family that genuinely respects you. Share your own experience with enforcing strict boundaries against toxic family dynamics in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories of reclaiming your life.